Hank Hanegraaff is the president of the Christian Research Institute, CRI. CRI is a Protestant apologetics organization. On the off chance you've been living in a cave for the last 3 months, Hanegraaff converted to Eastern Orthodoxy in April of this year. Ever since then, the Orthodox nomenclatura have been in a frenzy, trying to make this newcomer the face of the church. If you are Orthodox yourself and have dared question this policy, then you've probably found yourself unfriended, blocked from Orthodox Facebook groups, and called a Pharisee. Blogger Perry Robinson has experienced that and more, but he continues speaking out because, as a former employee of Hanegraaff at CRI, he knows firsthand what kind of man Hanegraaff is. Perry joins me on the phone. Perry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul. I'm glad to be here.
Perry, when Hanegraaff converted, hysteria broke out across the Protestant blogosphere. You wrote about this. The Pen and Pulpit said that Hanegraaff had left Christianity and taken up witchcraft. You're not exactly enthusiastic about Hanegraaff's conversion either, but you're coming at it from an Orthodox perspective.
Yeah, that I think gives me somewhat of a unique perspective on it, that and some other facts. I don't begrudge, just to be clear, Hanegraaff conversion to Orthodoxy. I just think that there are a lot of remaining problems and systemic problems that continue, so it ends up being kind of a slow-moving train wreck.
Perry, what's your story in Orthodoxy?
Well, I try not to give a conversion story. I don't think mine is especially illuminating, but generally, my religious history goes something like this. I was baptized Roman Catholic. I was raised in the Episcopal Church. In the teenage years, I was a member of a non-denominational church in Southern California, where I live. Then I became Reformed for a number of years, and then eventually I returned to my Anglican roots, where I met my wife in a conservative Anglican denomination. And then in 2000, we were both received into the Orthodox Church. A watershed moment happened for me in 1997 when I ran across the writings of Maximus the Confessor. And Maximus presented a unique solution to certain pressing problems within philosophical theology revolving around the problem of evil and divine simplicity. And so it was that take that really captured and revolutionized my understanding of Christian theology, and that's what drew me to Orthodoxy. So I had spent a number of years, I committed myself to reading the entire Schaff and Weiss series of the Church Fathers, the 38 volumes.
The big green books.
The blue, green, and red. It took me about 4 years to do. And obviously I don't remember everything I read, but, I wanted to be able to say that I had read through the text and had some familiarity with them. And I did undergraduate degree in philosophy, and then I was in graduate school at Texas A&M and at St. Louis University in philosophy, where my area of specialization eventually became the metaphysics of late antiquity and medieval philosophy.
Now, you're pretty rigorous with yourself, so you took 4 years to read through that entire massive collection of books. And, Perry, from what you've written about in your blogs and from what you've told me in phone conversations, that's basically the tenor of your life. As a kid, you were just consumed with apologetics.
Yeah, when I was growing up in the 1970s to kind of date myself, and there was a big transition with the divorce explosion. And so my life became unhinged, and church was the only thing that was stable. And so I wanted to find out if Christianity was true or not, because I didn't want to be surprised and find out that this was another facade, some kind of social construct that was hollow. So I set myself out to learning as much about Christianity as I could. And so that kind of set me on the road to apologetics. And I ran into, of course, Walter Martin, and I was influenced by Walter Martin.
You mean
over
you
the
ran
radio
into,
for many years?
So you ran into his radio show?
Yes, I did.
So you didn't run into him personally, in other words?
No, I never knew Martin personally. And we'll obviously get to that stuff later. But Martin had a big influence on me Partly because when I was 14 and just starting to learn, I ran into people from the Way International, which is an anti-Trinitarian group. And as Martin would say, they turned me into a theological pretzel in about 15 minutes.
Yeah,
And
they're good at that.
So, yeah, I was just a 14-year-old kid, so I went to the library and started reading up on groups and things like this, and Martin helped me along the way. So that was kind of my, for lack of a better term, I guess, or expression, my experience with Martin, how he helped me. So I branched out after that. I did a lot of counter-cult apologetics on the street. When other kids are 16-year-olds, they're going to parties and things like this. I would be going to Jehovah's Witness Kingdom Halls with my friends and sitting through the meetings so that I could witness to them afterwards. That was kind of the person I was. And so I did a lot of street-level apologetics, and with JWs, Mormons, Christadelphians, Mind Science, you name it. Eventually, I branched out into philosophy and church history and historical theology.
And you combined the two.
Yeah. So one kind of led to the other. And then in 1990, I got my dream job at Christian Research Institute, which was then in Irvine, California, at the 17 Hughes address.
And that was just after the death of Walter Martin.
Yes, it was. Martin had died in latter part of 89. And I got hired there about the following year. And I was just tickled pink. I had plans. This would be part of my college education. I was going to be a professional apologist. Some of that was, I was a young kid, and this was the place where my hero had been and set up. So, you can understand the enthusiasm.
Okay, when you say kid, how old?
I was 19.
So you were 19, and you're an apologetics junkie, and you land a job at CRI. And as you said, that had to be mind-blowing. How long was it before you became gravely disillusioned?
Well, unfortunately, the disillusionment started really within the first week. And again, I did not expect this. As some of your listeners may not know, about a year or so prior to Martin's death, and then subsequently a year after, Martin's right-hand man and really the spearhead of the Bible Answer Man program was Craig Hawkins. And so I was very familiar with Craig, and then all of a sudden Craig wasn't on the air anymore. And so when I got there, I asked a question that I found out you weren't supposed to ask. And I asked, what happened to Craig Hawkins? And I was immediately told, we don't talk about that. Those were the words that were given to me.
Okay, so one of your coworkers said that.
Yes, I worked in a couple different departments. My main department was correspondence processing, but I also worked in accounts receivable, and I also worked in the BAM studio in a lower level position.
BAM stands for Bible Answer Man.
Yes, I wasn't by any means some higher up. I wasn't having morning heart-to-hearts with Hanegraaff or the vice president staff. I certainly knew Hanegraaff, and I knew other people there. But that question really set the tone, because if you're dealing with cults and authoritarian groups and mind control groups and things like this, one of the hallmarks is there are certain things you can't talk about. And to say we can't talk about that, this guy who's the right-hand man of Martin, that was very troubling to me. So I kept my mouth shut, and over time I started seeing different things that just did not add up or that were just flat out wrong.
All right, and so you were in the correspondence department, Perry, and as I discussed with Jay Howard, a man who wrote the book on Hanegraaff, you ended up getting terminated from CRI. Can you go into that for us?
Yeah, what had happened was about 4 months or so before my firing in February of 1992, I had confided with some of the information that I had discovered, or at least seemed highly problematic, in another employee that I thought I could trust. And it turned out that this employee was still very loyal to the organization, which is understandable. and outed me. But fortunately, I didn't reveal everything I knew. So I was called into the vice president of research department, which was then headed by Bob Lyle. And Lyle proceeded to ream me for about 45 minutes on all these lies that I was spreading. And I basically backpedaled and told Bob, well, look, nobody talks about this stuff. We're not allowed to ask these questions. What am I supposed to think? Right? So until somebody tells me what's been going on, what am I supposed to think about Craig Hawkins? What am I supposed to think about agony of deceit or lead us not into deception and these other problems? So I was able to backpedal it, but immediately what happened for the next 3 or 4 months is every possible reason to fire me that you could imagine came up. So I was going to community college in the morning at Fullerton College and then driving all the way down the 57 freeway through the Orange Crush, which is the interchange of the 57, the 5 freeway, and the 22, which is a mess, down to Irvine every day and working a full-time job for the rest of the day into the evening. So you're going to hit traffic. So you might be 5 minutes late or 5 minutes early, depending on what the traffic is going to be. Well, I started getting dinged for being 1 minute late. Well, this had never been an issue before because I'd always, I'll work an extra 10 minutes over. It's not a big deal. I took a personal phone call. I got written up, had to have a meeting for that. I was having to have meetings for just about every little thing, and it became very clear very quickly that this was an attempt to terminate me. So I just conformed to everything. I left school a half hour earlier, so no matter what the traffic was, I always got there on time, didn't take any personal calls, nothing. So it became difficult for them to find grounds to legitimately fire me. And at the time, I was Reformed, and I was in the middle of a little exodus out of Calvary Chapel with a bunch of other Calvinists. And the Calvary pastors didn't really like that, but their charge of heresy really didn't stick because I was one of the ringleaders and I worked at CRI. So they went to CRI and complained. And that put CRI in a difficult position because, this is what this guy does on his own time. And they didn't consider Calvinism heresy, so there was no legitimate theological complaint as far as CRI was concerned. So what they did is Bob Lyle and Jane Huckabee decided that it was just best that the Lord lead me somewhere else. And I was let go. And since California is an at-will state, they didn't have to give me a reason. But it was very clear to me that they had been trying to fire me for a number of months prior to that.
It's interesting that you said this is what mind control cults do. You know, that sounded very much like Mind Spring and some of their tactics. And yet you're working at the most prestigious counter-cult organization of the late 80s, early 90s, and they're behaving just like the cults they're exposing. Ladies and gentlemen.
That's the irony, is that CRI ends up becoming this personality cult with all the marks of a personality cult. So I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later.
Ladies and gentlemen, the blog is called energeticprocession.wordpress.com. That's an erudite blog run by Perry Robinson. Perry, one of the objections that you and I continually encounter when we speak negatively about Hank Hanegraaff is that Hanegraaff is a genius with an encyclopedic knowledge of the faith. But you, Perry, from your experience at CRI, have actually been in the studio during the recording of the BAM radio show. BAM, of course, stands for Bible Answer Man. You've seen what actually goes on behind the scenes. Why don't you tell us about the radio magic and sleight of hand that makes Hanegraaff look and sound so good?
Yeah, some of this is confirmed by other former employees like Mike Stevens and others who worked in the radio engineering department, so it's not just my word. There are multiple eyewitnesses to this. When Hanegraaff came to CRI, in his own words, as he expressed in a recent interview with Frank Beckwith, he really knew nothing about cults or apologetics. So he had to crib from the other employees who actually had degrees, because to be a researcher, you actually had to have earned degrees, at least a bachelor's degree to be even considered for hiring. It had to be a bachelor's degree in a relevant field. So what people have to understand about the BAM show is first, now that Hanegraaff's been doing this for 25 years, he's gotten better at this kind of facade. But generally, he has a number of tools. He only answers about 5 to 6 questions per hour. He has a call screener, of course, and so he can screen out all the hard questions that he's really not qualified to answer. He also has about a 10-second delay, or at least he did when I was there, because it gets shot up over satellite.
So he can dump a call if it goes bad then.
Yes, he can. He can just turn down the volume and make it seem like he's answering the person, and the person doesn't have anything further to say. And then be like, okay, I hope that helps. Now we're on to the next question. These are tools that he uses. Now, he has a computer in the desk, which he uses for caller ID, but also to look up information. When he first started on BAM, there was no computer there. So there were other employees from the research department, such as Erwin DeCastro, who was a junior researcher, who would literally feed Hanegraaff text to read from other people's work or standard statements for CRI in a particular issue. Now, I was not very old, but I had done enough apologetics to realize that if you're doing this, you're really not qualified. And then on top of that, Hanegraaff was just making all kinds of egregious historical and theological mistakes. Initially, he kept talking about 3 separate persons in the Trinity. That was one. He couldn't put major historical events within 5 centuries. If you can't nail down the Crusades of the Inquisition within 500 years, you probably don't know what you're talking about. So what happened is whenever Hank would make a major screw-up, the BAM show for that day would become mysteriously unavailable because the error was so bad and it took up so much time that they just couldn't edit it out of the tape that would then be purchased for distribution, to the public. So I learned very quickly.
It just went down the George Orwell memory hole, in other words.
Right, exactly. So what people are seeing in the show is not reality. It's a facade. He has no earned degrees in any field, not plumbing, not HVAC. He has no earned degrees. He has 3 years at Calvin College, I believe, as an undergraduate, which he dropped out from. And he can't read the biblical languages. He has no competence in philosophy or church history. So it's all just a big show. It's fakery. This is why he doesn't generally do debates. Because on a debate, you have to do a couple things. You have to construct an argument, present it, and respond on your feet. You have to be able to think through your opponent's objection right then and there. You don't get time to edit it out or hit the mute button. So the one debate he did with a Dallas Seminary graduate, which is on YouTube for viewing, gets annihilated.
Is that Mark Hitchcock, the eschatology debate?
Yeah, that's the Hitchcock debate over Revelation. And you can see Hanegraaff about 2/3 of the way through becomes visibly angry and starts lashing out at people in the audience because he's losing the debate really bad, which is really not professional and not somebody with his supposed stature should be doing. So he's really incompetent as a theologian, as a philosopher, and this is why you generally get the same questions over and over again. After about a year, you've pretty much heard everything Hank's going to say, both in terms of verbosity, using a lot of big words to make it sound like he's educated. But he's like a JW. Once you get the JW off his memorized spiel, he's helpless. So to illustrate very quickly, a few months ago, there was a caller who called in who was an Orthodox catechumen. And the catechumen asked him about arguments against the papacy from an Orthodox point of view, because the guy's wife was still Catholic and she didn't want to convert. And so this was the linchpin for her, which is understandable. Hanegraaff talks for 7 minutes, and he can't name one argument. He cannot provide one argument against the papacy from an Orthodox perspective.
Perry,
Now,
Perry, what in several of your blog posts, there's this exasperated expression that keeps cropping up, and it goes along the lines of, after 30 years of doing theology 5 days a week, he should know this by now. So,
no, I think that's exactly right. He should. I mean, he for example, he does not understand the Protestant view on justification, that works are merely contiguous to faith. They don't participate in justification. He doesn't understand either a Catholic or an Orthodox view on justification, that our good works under the power of grace are God's works, and therefore they please him. There's not these two things next to each other. They're actually one and the same thing. He doesn't understand that. Now, I use myself as the measure for this because it's about the same amount of time. I learned these things because I read the Reformers. I read Lutheran scholastics. I read Reformed scholastics. I went to lecture after lecture of contemporary Reformation authors from, John Gerstner and Mike Horton and people like this for months. So I'm not holding him to a standard that I don't hold myself to. But he should have been able to articulate these things even before he was received into the church. But he can't.
Well,
because he really doesn't know what he's doing.
Perry, what you are doing is what a scholar is supposed to do, and that is to go back to the primary sources. Ad fontes is what they said in the Reformation. Whereas you have pointed out that Hanegraaff will not do anything beyond a mere surface level. I think the phrase you said that he uttered in your presence once was, "The research has been done, now all we have to do is package it."
Yeah, and I'm not the only person he said that to. So this is why CRI really hasn't done any cutting in apologetics in almost 30 years. The research staff has been liquidated. He publishes popular books under his name, which there's ample reason out there. He's been called on the carpet for having ghostwriters for these books. So when he presents himself as having written 20 books, well, I'm very doubtful of that. Researchers put together entire sections of Christianity in Crisis. There are other books that he took the titles of from other authors who already had books published on this. This has been out there. If you wanted to use Google to see it, it should at least strike people as red flags, that there's enough smoke there that there's probably fire in there somewhere. But in general, all of this is just a facade. He's not an apologist like someone like William Lane Craig. So I have my disagreements, obviously, with Bill Craig, and I'm not anywhere near the academic stature of Bill Craig is. But Craig actually has earned degrees. He actually does debates with prominent figures. He actually writes books on philosophy published by major publishers like Oxford and Brill and places like this. He has the bona fides. Hanegraaff is at best a popularizer who has to have information fed to him. I mean, he's a glorified teleprompter reader.
And
so it's an entirely false appearance that you're getting.
It's okay for the Christian faith to have popularizers, but when the popularizer portrays himself as an academic, that's the problem. And Perry, Hanegraaff has made himself appear, if people just listen for 20 minutes here and there, to be a top apologist, and he's done it by means of the sleight of hand that you've talked about in the radio studio. Now, according to your blog, though, the ironic result of that is that the Christian Research Institute now, under Hanegraaff, is at an extremely rudimentary level of apologetic sophistication. It's really not very scholarly at all.
No, it's not. As I said before, they have another problem on top of that. Because their stuff is so basic, for the most part, you can find it just about anywhere. You can find what they provide on the internet just about anywhere. And the majority of books and materials that they provide, especially the books, I mean, you can just get them on Amazon. You can get them over the internet through various booksellers. There's no particular reason to go through CRI. There's nothing really unique that they're offering. And people, for example, in the counter-cult community know that the really best stuff, for example, on Jehovah's Witnesses. You don't go to CRI for the best stuff on Jehovah's Witnesses. You go to Dwayne Magnani's Witness Inc. If you want some of the best stuff on the Mormons, you go to the Tanners and people like this. It's long since been the case that CRI has nothing substantial to offer on apologetics other than just getting your feet wet.
Well, at one time they did, because, of course, that was the foundation that was established by Walter Martin. Regrettably, you cannot get Martin's materials through CRI anymore.
Yeah, to my knowledge, you can't, no.
Ladies and gentlemen, the website is energeticprocession.wordpress.com. The blogger is Perry Robinson. Perry, you have exposed Hanegraaff as being less than what he presents himself to be. What I'm concerned about is that when listeners hear this, they may decide not to take Hanegraaff as seriously as we should and to recognize the dangers that are inherent in his portrayal of himself. So what I want to do, Perry, is I want to go to your blog, and I'm going to read an excerpt. This is how it starts. It is one thing to make that kind of money drilling for oil, trading stocks, or real estate, and it is quite another to make it off the backs of ordinary people who send their sacrificial donations in every month without fail to a quote-unquote ministry. It is one thing to think of this giving as an abstraction, and it is quite another to have processed hundreds of them every day, as I did when I worked at CRI. You see the little handwritten notes on the checks or donation slips? Single parents to old ladies who scrape together the extra cash at the end of the month to send in, thanking Hank for doing the Lord's work. All the while, you are aware of the little tricks and tweaks to get around the sales tax, squeeze out another $1 donation, or further sales of Hank's latest thing for some quote-unquote gift. End of the excerpt. You know, Perry,
Yeah.
I try to be level-headed as much as I can and to keep my cool because the Bible says make no friendship with an angry man. But my blood boiled when I read that line about the little notes that are written on there from people who are sacrificially giving. And Hanegraaff lives in this sprawling mansion in an elite part of North Carolina.
Yeah, that's right. What people have to understand here, it's not that Hank has money. I don't think that there's something problematic about being wealthy. But if you're making your money off of sacrificial giving in the name of Christ, you should not be having a lavish lifestyle. That's the first point. The second point is, I'm not holding Hanegraaff to a standard he doesn't hold other people to. He regularly denounces people on TBN and other venues, Word Faith teachers, all the popular televangelists, for living a lavish lifestyle at the expense of ordinary people. Now, regardless of their theological quackadoxy on TBN, the principle is still the same and applicable to Hank. Hank lives, to my knowledge, and this is public record, so I'm not gossiping, in a 9,200 square foot, $3.1 million house in Charlotte, North Carolina. Now, if you were to buy a house for that price in, say, Newport Beach, California, on the coast, that would get you probably a 1,500 to 1,800 square foot little house on the beach. So you wouldn't be getting a lot, but you're paying for location. But he's got a 9,200 square foot house. Now, people will say, well, that's because he has 12 kids. Well, most of his kids are all adults, and they have been for some time. They're not necessarily living there. He lives on essentially a country club estate. The entrance fee for the country club, I believe, which is also public record, is about $65,000 for the entrance fee, and it's about $1,000 a month.
And $65,000 is more than what the average American grosses in a year as well.
Yeah, well, I mean that's real money to the rest of us poor people. I mean, ordinary people, $65K is not chump change.
Perry, are you speculating that the reason he moved the Christian Research Institute from California to North Carolina was that his real estate dollars would go farther?
Well, it's interesting you say that. That's a possible speculation, and to be fair, I don't want to try and speculate. But I do know that when he was here in California, where I reside, he purchased a home in Coto de Caza, which is prime real estate in Southern California, a brand new home for $731,000 in, I believe, about 1992, which is also public record. And you have to understand, $731,000 then was a lot of money. And it was I believe about a 4,800 or 5,200 square foot house. So it wasn't a small house. And then, of course, he lies about it that he never paid that amount of money for the house. He just flat out lies. There's a YouTube video of it you can see called Did Hank Hanegraaff Lie About His House, made by another former employee.
For the listeners, that YouTube channel is Mr. Call Me the Seeker.
Right.
Yeah,
that's another former employee.
On that same channel, there is a video of Hanegraaff blatantly reading straight out of Walter Martin's book, The Kingdom of the Cult, and passing it off as his own answer on the Bible Answer Man show.
Yeah, he does that, and I document that even recently. In the last 3 months, for example, he gets a call on justification, and then he just reads off a prepared statement with the appropriate pauses interjected in to make it sound like he's just doing it off the top of his head. But he's just cribbing from this. So he really doesn't understand the theology. But the point about his lying about the house to callers in the past is that you can't take him at his word. Even though he sounds really sincere, how would you ever know if he's telling the truth or not? You know he's demonstratedly lies. You know he misrepresents himself and uses the works of others without attribution. And the most troubling thing, in my mind, is there are instances where Hank is essentially selling doctrinal approval for the ability to have speaking opportunities or the exchange of funds. He's selling doctrinal indulgences, for lack of a better term.
Right. That's the term that you used with me in our phone conversation, and I thought it was wonderfully evocative. Let's elaborate a little bit more on that. Explain what an indulgence is and how it applies to Hank Hanegraaff.
Well, the crass popular medieval understanding in Catholicism was that for those people who were going to end up in heaven and had to go through purgatory, they could, one of the kinds of acts of charity that they could do to lessen the time in purgatory was by making a monetary donation. And this, of course, through John Tetzel, scandalized Luther because it gave the impression that somebody could buy forgiveness. And so that set off the Reformation debates, as you and I'm sure many of your listeners know. So Hank is selling approval, and I witnessed this in a debacle with a group in Southern California at the time called Set Free. But there are many other groups that I strongly suspect or have good reason to think that this was actually done.
All right, let's back up just a moment, Perry. Who are Set Free?
Set Free was a group in the early 90s that was affiliated with TBN. They were a biker church, for lack of a better term. And what had happened is a number of complaints had been made about abuses of power, potentially selling of drugs within the church and things like this. I don't know if any of those things were true, but these were the complaints that were conveyed to Odin Fong at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. These complaints eventually became so serious that Fong handed over everything to CRI. CRI then issued a statement saying that they could not recommend Set Free as a church because of all of these problems, that there was sufficient evidence there to warrant that there were significant problems in the leadership. So what happened in my case was we would, every once in a while, we would get a letter and a donation from somebody who really didn't understand our ministry. So you'd have some Mormon lady listening in Utah, listening to our show critiquing Jehovah's Witnesses, which she thought was just hot diggity, right? So she'd send in $20. And then she'd say, I'm Mormon and I love your ministry. So what we would do is put the money in a pending account and send her a letter saying, well, it's really not right for us to take your money. If you still want to give it to us, that's fine, but this is who we are. We also critique the Mormon church, for example. So I started getting letters from Set Free, people in Set Free, saying Set Free loves CRI and things like this. And I went to my boss across the hallway, who was Cindy DeVore. And I said, Cindy, should I just put this in whatever the 4-digit account was, like 4080 or whatever the account was? and send them the standard blurb. And she says, no, just put it in the general donation fund and route the letter to research, which was not what we were supposed to do. But she was my boss. And I said, but yeah, we should do this and just route it to research, Perry. Okay. And then another one came through, and another one, and another one. That was the first day. The second day, we started getting all these pink envelopes with Set Free printed on them. Dozens of them. And it was the same thing. Route them to research. Put the funds in the general donation. Route it to research. Now, one of the other jobs, responsibilities that I had was tracking the mail. So the mail was batched into groups, and we would keep mail by date and batch number up to 2 years back. We had a catalog system in the back warehouse. This was in case there was a mistake in an order. So we could go back and say, we missed this, or no, you didn't actually order this. So it was just to cover our behind, so to speak. It was just good business practice. None of those letters ended up back there in the batches with the other mail for that day, which is where they should have gone. Now, the third day, we got boxes, post office boxes full of these letters. So we're talking 3 or 4 of these boxes filled with letters of donations from Set Free in these bright pink letters and envelopes. They all went up to Hank's office. And I never saw them again. Now, that by itself seems bad, but I was walking down the hall and I ran into Jane Huckabee. And that means, of course, nothing to any of your listeners, but Jane was one of the vice presidents at CRI. And I asked Jane, so Jane, what's going on with all the Set Free stuff? Keep getting all these letters and I'm sending them to research, but it's kind of weird. So I'm playing dumb. And Jane obliges me and says, well, what happened is Hank was on the phone with Phil Aguilar trying to work out a deal where he could do his personal witness training at Set Free. And what happened, she said, is Aguilar taped the phone conversation without Hanegraaff knowing it, which I believe at the time in California was not illegal to do. And then she said that Aguilar leveraged that recording against Hanegraaff, that he better go through with the deal or Aguilar will just let the tape come out to the public. So we were stuck taking all those donations. We couldn't get out of it as an organization without humiliating Hank.
So what we have is a doctrinally dubious organization that, for lack of a better word, is able to blackmail or strong-arm Hanegraaff into giving them cover, giving them legitimacy through the name of CRI.
Yeah, and the doctrinal statement that CRI had done on Set Free was yanked within a few days. So there were other books that I noticed that we yanked. And I don't know if you want to get into this here or later on.
Just let it fly.
But this was not the only case. So, for example, there was another book by a guy named Gomes out of Biola, out of Talbot School of Theology, professor of theology there, called Lead Us Not Into Deception. The book had an endorsement from Bob and Gretchen Passantino. It had a front page endorsement from Walter Martin, I believe himself. It had been sold from CRI. It was an expose of Youth with a Mission's finite God teaching. So this is like open theism before open theism existed. And so CRI had been selling this expose, but all of a sudden we stopped selling it. So this is about 1991. And this is, of course, before the days of caller ID. So you could, crank call anybody you wanted as a kid and get away with it because nobody knew where you were calling from, right? So when I got home, I called up Alan Gomes and I said, Dr. Gomes, I said, you don't know who I am. I said, but I work at CRI. And I can't tell you who I am, but I want to know, is YWAM still teaching the finite God doctrine? And he said, yes. I said, has anything changed substantially with Youth with a Mission? Have they sat down to talk with you? They negotiated their position, any kind of movement? He says, no. I said, do you know why they pulled the book? And he says, no. And this was done in a number of other cases where materials would be pulled, which is why I am so very suspicious that the deal, the change in position of CRI on witness lien in the local church reeks to high heaven.
And that's far more recent, too.
Yeah, that's very recent. On top of that, with witness lien in the local church, one of the CRI board members self-confessedly says that he's been going to the local church for multiple years. Well, how can you be an impartial judge of a group when one of your board members is a de facto member of the church that you're evaluating? That's a direct conflict of interest.
Well, I hate to sound like a cliche, but where there's smoke, there's fire. And I don't have hard evidence for this at all, Perry, but there's anecdotal evidence all over the internet from people who belong to the Worldwide Church of God and belonged to it in the 90s when CRI decided to remove its cult label. You know, the people who were actually on the ground in the Worldwide Church of God said, no, the theology hasn't changed at all. Joseph Tkach is either pulling the wool over Hanegraaff's eyes or something more nefarious is going on. So
yeah, I mean, I don't know about that case. I do know about Set Free, and I do know about some of these other cases, and I do know I was not alone in this. And really, what people have to understand is we were all loyal to CRI. We all sacrificed financially and career-wise to work there because we believed in its mission. We didn't go there to try and find problems. We didn't complain because we were fired. We were whistleblowers within the organization. So these kinds of problems are brought to light by people from every level of the organization, right? From the shipping department all the way up to board members, to members of the Martin family. Darlene Martin served on the board for a number of years before Hank booted her off the board. And we all have the same kind of story. And the only thing that's constant is Hanegraaff.
The couplet that Johann Tetzel used to like to sing was, "When the groschen in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." I guess we can say in this case, the cult from cult status springs.
Yeah, something definitely like that, I think, has been going on. And that's really why it's the most serious problem, because CRI was set up to expose and to inform the public of what was actually inside the can of whatever it is they were buying.
Ladies and gentlemen, the blog is energeticprocession.wordpress.com. Perry Robinson runs that blog. Perry, I got wind of Hanegraaff's attending Orthodox parishes, maybe a year and a half, 2 years back. The way my informant framed it was that Hanegraaff was simply sick of all of the schism and heresy in Protestantism. But from what I've read on your Facebook posts and elsewhere, you conjecture that Hanegraaff converted because his evangelical milch cow had dried up. Why don't you expand on that a little?
Well, I think it's a lot of different factors coming together. I think what you mentioned is probably true. That's been communicated to me from people inside the parish, people who know family members. As St. Paul says, we even have members inside of Caesar's household, right, kind of thing. So I think there's truth to that. I also know that Hanegraaff has made a lot of enemies in the evangelical community over the years. And his speaking opportunities have dried up. And, of course, he's no spring chicken at 67 years of age either. So the way he's positioned himself is to try and hold on to everything he has in the evangelical community while expanding his teaching empire into the Orthodox Church through official teaching platforms like OCN and, to some limited extent, Ancient Faith Radio. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and in Hanegraaff's case. I think he's tired of all the gimmicky stuff in evangelicalism, that's a legitimate complaint. But the doctrines that he picks out as not changing for him, but did change, which is really weird, are theosis and the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Well, the Lutherans profess a doctrine of Christ in the Eucharist as well. And they have a doctrine of theosis as well. It's not the Orthodox doctrine, but it is a doctrine of deification. And he could have gotten away from all the quackery in, non-denominational land by becoming Lutheran or becoming some kind of high church Anglican or something like that. So I don't think his position is a well thought out theological position. I think it's this kind of visceral reaction to all the gimmickiness, and it's a new business opportunity. So I think it's both. I think also with his kids, some of his kids are very tired of a lot of that stuff in evangelicalism. And from what I understand, they actually started attending first, and Hanegraaff came later. And I could be wrong about that, but that's what sources at the parish communicated to me. Now, I knew that he was going to be received about a month prior, but I was asked to say nothing. And I kept my word in that. I had been hearing rumors like you about a year before, but there was no solid evidence, and I wasn't going to jump on something there was no solid evidence for.
Well, Perry, the troubling thing, both to you and to me, is that the Orthodox intelligentsia, or should we say the pop stars of Orthodoxy, people like Frederica Matthewes-Green, have wildly enthusiastically rushed to make Hanegraaff the new face of the church. And you and I are both aware of 1 Timothy 5:22, which warns against elevating new converts to positions of authority and celebrity. Perry, let's spend just a little bit of time talking about the dangers of putting new converts in these kind of positions because of what they may say doctrinally, which is simply an error.
Yeah, I mean, this is really not rocket science. Anybody should be able to see that the Pauline principle, the scriptural principle, is applicable here, whether it's ordination or some other lay teaching position. The most recent example is Frankie Schaeffer, as I'm sure you and many other people are aware. That didn't turn out great. I think Frankie was sincere, and I don't think Frankie was out to feather his own nest and, make a fortune for himself. It was pretty clear to me, even before I was Orthodox, that he had certain issues that made him somewhat volatile. But when you put the reputation of the church on a person like that, and you put them out in front, you're just asking for a fall. You're asking with a fall with sexual temptation, with monetary temptation, with all of these things. So there's a potential scandal there. So that's just a no-brainer. And then doctrinally, contrast Hanegraaff with someone like Yaroslav Pelikan, the notable church historian of the last century. Pelikan was a Lutheran, and he converted to Orthodoxy in, I believe, his early 80s. Now, Pelikan has a vita that's as long as my leg in what he's published. He knows the biblical languages, the academic languages. He's published more stuff on church history than most of us will ever read. If you want to put him up and do an interview with someone like that, well, there's some gravitas there. There's substance there. There's something you can actually learn from somebody like that because of the insights that they can bring.
Yeah, when you say the name Yaroslav Pelikan, everybody bends the knee.
Exactly, and with good reason. And there are other figures like that. There's John Jones out of Marquette University, who converted from Catholicism. He was a substantial Heideggerian scholar and is now a major scholar on late Platonism. He does some amazing work. There are other people like that really have the bona fides and the stature to warrant some kind of position in terms of, bringing them on the radio and interviewing them and things like this. But even now with OCN is now carrying Hanegraaff's show for free. Now, let's think about this. This is a Protestant show, regardless of Hanegraaff's beliefs, and he really doesn't know Orthodox theology very well, as he himself has said. They're carrying his show for free, and they have promoted his books, which were Protestant, written when he was a Protestant, to our church members. And what's going to happen, for example, when Hanegraaff goes in for his bone marrow transplant and is off the air for 6 weeks? What, you think some Orthodox priest is going to walk in and do that show? No, he's probably going to have Protestant fill-ins that's going to be carrying Protestant teaching right into our church using our church's media platform.
Well, Perry,
And all of this was foreseeable.
I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the concept of free radio time. Are you kidding me? He's getting free radio time?
Yeah, they're carrying it for free. So here's how it works. Hanegraaff gets all the control over the show. He gets to ask for donations for his private Protestant business, which CRI still is, and he gets none of the accountability.
Perry, how much does a radio show generally cost?
Well, I don't know since I'm not in the radio business, but I do know that when Hanegraaff was here in Southern California, he was being carried on one of Calvary Chapel stations, K-Wave. And K-Wave was generating per month in the early 90s between $40,000 and $60,000 a month in donations. That was one station. Now, granted, it was a large venue in Southern California, but 40 to 60K in 1992, that's not chump change.
Yeah, I can tell you, Perry, from my own experience in radio, when I'm here in the Phoenix area, back in the 1990s when I was a new convert, there was a Orthodox radio show here in town, and I occasionally was a guest on that show. The bill just for 1 hour on a local radio station was $400 for 1 hour. And that's the 90s. Now, of course, one of my other heroes, the notorious Bob Larson, was infamous for always begging for, I need $111.56 to save a station. So in the 1980s, it was $111.56 to run an hour of airtime. So the thrust of this is we have a new convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, and he's basically been made a little prince. He's been given free airtime, and there's no telling what he's going to say on that free airtime that may reflect badly upon the Orthodox Church or may simply be inaccurate.
Right. I mean, they've given him the keys of the kingdom in under 3 months. The chrism isn't even dry. This should be a no-brainer. He should have to sit down and be quiet for at least 3 years. What he does on his own program obviously is problematic in and of itself, as he's a church member. But carrying him over our media platforms or promoting him, as AFR did with their interview with Frederica Matthewes-Green, and it was promotion because it was a puff piece. He got to talk about everything he wanted and nothing he didn't. And his conversion, as far as that being newsworthy there, well, that just ignores all the Martin family members and the other former employees like myself. That just ignores them and assumes that our claims have no merit. So they've acted like judge and jury and hence promoted him. And, of course, Hanegraaff's gone on non-Orthodox venues. He was on Catholic Answers promoting himself there, too. I mean, he's running around everywhere he can to get his foot in the door.
Perry, we talked about how doctrinal statements mysteriously disappear from the CRI's records when it no longer suits CRI or Hanegraaff. Interestingly enough, and this is something that I sent to you, the Christian Research Journal from the summer of 1995 had an article about converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. The person they were quoting is a man named Bradley Nassif, who converted from Orthodoxy to Protestantism. And he was critiquing the people going the other direction, and he was especially critiquing Frank Schaeffer. And with regard to Frank Schaeffer, he writes this, quote, "If he thinks he had trouble with evangelicalism, he hasn't seen anything yet. Whoever his spiritual father is has done him a great disservice by parading him around like this. He should have been kept silent for 5 years after his conversion to Orthodoxy for prayer and meditation." End of Mr. Nassif's quote. It would be nice if Hanegraaff applied that to himself, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think most converts are told, you should just be quiet. We understand you're excited to be here, but there's a lot you don't know, and it's not about you. So sit down and be quiet, enjoy the show, so to speak, and you'll fill in stuff as you go. And it's just some basic wisdom. It's not very hard to see at all.
Perry, our time has expired, but I want you to stick around so that we can talk about the influence that Hanegraaff may have on what people perceive Eastern Orthodoxy to be and all the doctrinal difficulties pertaining to that. Perry, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.